While lying in bed with my unfaithful wife, I checked my phone and found a shocking message that I showed her. Everything started falling apart after that. Hey everyone, my name is Tyler, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a construction project manager here in Tampa, where I've been living for the past few years. I've never once regretted making the move down here. The eternal sunshine and beautiful beaches are absolutely perfect for my lifestyle. The work pays well too, managing big construction projects that keep me busy, but also allow me to live comfortably in a nice area of the city. I drive a solid truck, live in a decent neighborhood, and from the outside looking in, life seems pretty good. Last Thursday evening, it had been raining steadily since noon. It wasn't a harsh downpour, just that quiet, steady rain that makes you feel like the sky is hiding something important. I still remember the hypnotic sound of my tires rolling over the wet pavement as I pulled into our driveway that night. My headlights cast soft, shimmering reflections across the puddles that had formed in the cracks I'd always meant to fix, but never got around to. The house looked completely normal from the outside. Warm light glowing through the windows, Jessica's car parked in its usual spot. But even before I walked through the front door, something deep inside me felt different. Not broken exactly, just shifted somehow. I had no idea that this ordinary Thursday night was about to turn my entire world upside down. The front door creaked in that familiar way it always did. That specific noise you get so used to after living somewhere long enough that you stop hearing it. I kicked off my work boots by the entrance and tossed my keys into the ceramic bowl we kept on the small table near the door. Out of pure habit, I called out, "Jessica!" without really thinking about it. There was no immediate answer, which wasn't unusual. I could hear the television playing at low volume from the living room, some sitcom with a laugh track that was barely audible over the sound of rain hitting our windows. The familiar background noise of our evening routine was all there, but something felt subtly wrong. When I turned the corner into the living room, I found her curled up on the couch with a thick throw blanket draped over her legs. She was holding her phone in that way people do when they're completely absorbed in whatever's on the screen, like it was glued to her hand. What struck me immediately was that she didn't even flinch when I walked into the room. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Instead, she just tilted the phone screen slightly away from me. It was barely subtle, but I definitely noticed it. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual and friendly. Just a simple greeting after a long day at work. She looked up then and smiled, but it happened too quickly, like she'd been waiting for her cue. "Hey babe, you're home early?" she responded, and I just nodded. Yeah, the job site had gotten rained out that day, so we'd wrapped up earlier than usual. There was a pause after that. Not a long one, but just long enough to feel distinctly awkward. She shifted her legs underneath the blanket and sat up a little straighter, tucking her phone under the blanket beside her as she did. "Want me to heat up some leftover pasta?" she asked. And that's when something clicked into place for me. It wasn't about the food or even the question itself. It was the tone she used, that practiced lightness that sounded too casual, too carefully managed. Like she had rehearsed this exact conversation in her head before I'd even walked through the door. Instead of answering her question about the pasta, I walked past her into the kitchen. I needed a moment to think, to process what I was feeling. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with cold water from the tap, then found myself just standing there, staring down at the sink. I was breathing slowly, deliberately, trying to make sense of the unease that had been building inside me for weeks now. It had been like this for a while. These little changes everywhere that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. The kisses that had become slower and less passionate than they used to be. The showers that seemed rushed now, like she was in a hurry to wash something away. The eye contact that used to linger between us had started disappearing way too soon, leaving conversations feeling incomplete and distant. There was also the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne that sometimes lingered when she came home late from work. When I'd mentioned it once, she'd casually explained it away, saying it was just from hugging a coworker goodbye after a long day. The thing is, Jessica works as a graphic designer, and she does most of her work remotely from our home office. She doesn't really do client meetings that would require the kind of physical interaction that involves hugging coworkers goodbye. But I'd told myself I was probably just imagining things, reading too much into small details that had perfectly reasonable explanations. Then there were the missed calls on her phone labeled work meeting. Calls that didn't make sense because she doesn't typically do field calls for her design work. Everything could be explained away individually, but the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. I'd been telling myself for too long that I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking normal changes that happen in any long-term relationship. But tonight, standing in our kitchen with that glass of cold water in my hands, the universe seemed determined not to let me stay in denial any longer. My phone buzzed once against the kitchen counter, jolting me out of my thoughts. I glanced down at the screen and saw Brandon's name. Of course it was Brandon calling. It's always Brandon in these kinds of situations, isn't it? The friend who ends up being the messenger for news you don't want to hear. Brandon had been my best man at our wedding. He's been my oldest friend since high school. He was the guy who helped me move in with Jessica when we first got serious. Hell, he'd even painted this very living room with me the week before our wedding, both of us covered in primer and laughing about how domestic we'd become. I stared at the phone screen for a moment, watching his name flash on the display. Something about the timing felt significant, like the universe was orchestrating this moment. I picked up the phone and tried to sound as normal as possible. "Yo," I said, forcing casualness into my voice that I didn't feel. His voice sounded thin and strained, like he was trying to hide behind a wall of uncertainty. "Hey, you busy right now?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that immediately put me on edge. "Not really. What's going on?" I replied, though I could feel my throat starting to feel dry with anticipation. There was a pause, long enough to signal that whatever he was calling about was serious. "You at home?" he asked, and that simple question sent a chill down my spine. I glanced toward the living room, where I could see just the corner of the blanket Jessica was still tucked under. "Yeah, why?" I managed to ask, though my voice cracked slightly with the weight of what I was starting to suspect. When Brandon responded, his voice was even more strained than before. "Can you step outside for a minute?" he asked, and everything seemed to slow down in that moment. I didn't ask why, didn't need an explanation. I just knew that whatever he was about to tell me would change everything. I didn't ask for any further explanation. I just walked through the hallway toward the front door, passing our wedding photo that hung on the wall. The one where Jessica is caught mid-laugh, her nose scrunched up in that adorable way, her bouquet half raised in celebration of what we thought would be our forever. The irony of that moment wasn't lost on me as I stepped out onto the front porch. The rain had slowed to just a light drizzle by then, creating a soft pattering sound against the roof above me. "Talk," I said into the phone, keeping my voice low even though I was outside. Brandon took a deep breath before speaking, and I could hear the weight of what he was about to say in that pause. "Look, man, I've been trying to stay out of this," he began, his voice heavy with reluctance. I didn't want to believe it myself, and I definitely didn't want to be the one to have to tell you this. But I can't keep sitting on this information anymore. My heart was already pounding, but I forced myself to stay quiet and let him continue. "I saw Jessica with someone last week," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "Actually, I saw her twice. Once at Harbor Boulevard near that coffee shop you guys like, and once near that art bar off 5th Street. She was with some guy both times." I still couldn't find words to respond. The silence stretched between us as I tried to process what he was telling me. "They were holding hands," Brandon added quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were laughing together, standing way too close to each other. Like, way more than just friends close, you know?" Before I could even begin to formulate a response, I heard the front door creak open behind me. I turned around slowly, already knowing what I would find. Jessica was standing there in the doorway, barefoot, with her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Her phone was still clutched in her hand like it had been all evening. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharpness that immediately put me on the defensive. I stared at her without saying a word, studying her face for any sign of guilt or surprise. Instead, what I saw was something that chilled me to the bone. "Is it Brandon?" she said, and the fact that she asked too quickly with too much certainty told me everything I needed to know. I lowered the phone without hanging up yet, keeping my eyes locked on hers. She narrowed her eyes at me in response, and I could see the wheels turning behind them. "Seriously, you're listening to him now?" she said, and then she did something that completely blindsided me. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind of caught-off-guard laugh you'd expect from someone who'd just been accused of cheating. This was a mocking laugh, delivered right to my face with stunning casualness. "I can't believe he actually did it," she said, shaking her head with what looked like genuine amusement. "He finally grew the balls to say something." I blinked at her, completely confused by her reaction. "What are you talking about?" I managed to ask. She took a step forward, squinting at me like I was the one who was doing something wrong here. "Let me guess what happened," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. He saw me having coffee with someone, and now suddenly he's playing the hero, right? The confidence in her voice was staggering. There was no denial, no surprise, no attempt to explain away what Brandon had seen. Instead, she was going on the offensive. "That little worm's had it out for me ever since the day we got married," she continued, her voice getting sharper with each word. "You don't see it, but I do. He's always had this pathetic little fantasy where I come running to him, crying about how terrible you are, and he gets to be the knight in shining armor who saves me." I stared at her in complete silence, unable to process the audacity of what she was saying. "Don't look at me like that," she snapped, clearly irritated by my stunned expression. "If you actually paid attention once in a while instead of working 12-hour shifts and coming home smelling like concrete dust, maybe you'd know what's going on in your own house." With that, she turned around and walked back inside, letting the screen door slap shut behind her with deliberate force. That was it, the moment when everything changed completely. It was like a curtain had been lifted, revealing that the game we'd been playing was entirely different from what I thought it was. In that quiet moment, with the rain still dripping off the eaves and her last words still ringing in my ears, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever we had once been, it had already fallen apart completely. I didn't go back inside right away. Instead, I stood on that porch for what felt like an eternity, my phone still clutched in my hand. Brandon was still on the line, and I could hear him breathing quietly, waiting for me to say something. He didn't hang up either. Maybe he knew I wasn't ready to hear more details yet, or maybe he understood that I needed this moment of silence to let everything sink in. "Are you still there?" he finally asked, his voice gentle and concerned. I couldn't bring myself to answer him. The weight of what had just happened felt too heavy for words. Instead, I ended the call and slipped my phone into my jacket pocket. Then I walked down the front steps into the drizzle, letting the cool moisture hit my face as I tried to make sense of what had just transpired. I found myself walking around the block slowly, aimlessly, like I was searching for something I'd lost on the sidewalk, but couldn't quite remember what it was. My face was burning, not from the cold night air, but from the pure, overwhelming humiliation of it all. You never really think it's going to happen to you, you know? Sure, we all know what goes on out there in the world, affairs, betrayal, lies whispered in someone else's bed while you're at home thinking everything is fine. But you always figure it won't be her. It won't be us. We had real history together. We'd had thousands of conversations, shared late-night snacks, taken road trips, paid bills together, survived fights and disagreements. I thought all of that meant something important. I thought our shared experiences protected us from becoming just another statistic. By the time I circled back to the house, the lights were off in the living room. Only the kitchen light above the sink remained on, casting everything in harsh fluorescent brightness like a spotlight illuminating a crime scene. I opened the front door as quietly as possible, expecting to find that Jessica had gone upstairs to bed. But she hadn't. Instead, she was sitting at our dining table, casually sipping a glass of red wine and scrolling through her phone with her legs crossed, looking perfectly composed. She had that calm, careless expression that only comes from someone who stopped giving a damn a long time ago. "You didn't even ask who it was," I said, breaking the silence that had settled over the house. She glanced up from her phone with one eyebrow slightly arched, as if my presence was mildly inconvenient. "Who what?" she replied with studied indifference. "The guy," I clarified, my voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside me. "The one Brandon saw you with." You didn't even pretend to be curious about who he was talking about. She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow, deliberate sigh that seemed designed to convey just how tedious she found this entire conversation. "Because I knew exactly what he was talking about the moment you said his name," she said simply. The casualness of her admission hit me harder than any angry denial would have. "You're not denying it then," I said, though it came out as more of a statement than a question. She looked me dead in the eyes and responded with chilling directness. Should I? That answer, those two simple words, hit me harder than anything else that had happened that night. I walked to the edge of the table and braced my hands against its surface for support, feeling like I needed something solid to hold on to. "So it's true then," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't show even the slightest hint of shame or regret. The silence stretched between us for a moment before I found the courage to ask the question that was burning in my throat. "How long has this been going on?" She stared at her phone for another second, then set it down gently and folded her arms across her chest. "A couple of months now," she said, with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. Who is he? I pressed, though part of me wasn't sure I really wanted to know. She smiled then, a tiny, cold smile that sent chills down my spine. You don't know him, she said dismissively. Try me. Instead of answering, she stood up and walked past me like I wasn't even there anymore. She opened the refrigerator and took out another bottle of wine, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd needed a second bottle to get through a difficult conversation. There was no hesitation in her movements, no visible guilt or emotional turmoil. She was just running on complete autopilot, like this was all perfectly routine for her. He's someone who actually listens, she said casually as she worked the cork out of the bottle, a motion she performed like she'd done it 100 times before. Someone who doesn't come home smelling like concrete every night. Someone who doesn't zone out the moment the TV goes on. I stared at her with my jaw clenched so tightly that my teeth were starting to hurt. That's your excuse for this? I managed to say through gritted teeth. I'm not making excuses, she replied matter-of-factly, pouring herself another full glass of wine. I'm just telling you what you never bothered to hear. I didn't speak. I couldn't find the words to respond to what she was saying. Part of me wanted to yell at her, to scream until my voice gave out, to smash that wine bottle against the floor, just to break the perfect image of her standing there looking so smug, so clean, so completely untouched by the consequences of what she'd done. Instead, I turned around and walked into the hallway, then slowly up the stairs. Every step felt like it belonged to someone else, like I was watching myself in a dream, floating through a version of my house that didn't feel like mine anymore. The bedroom door creaked when I opened it, and I noticed that the bed was made with hospital corners, too neatly, too precisely, like she'd been putting extra effort into maintaining appearances. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the same spot on the floor where I'd stood that morning when everything still felt normal. Only this time, everything was different. She was downstairs sipping wine like she'd earned a break from dealing with me, while I was upstairs drowning in the silence of every moment I hadn't seen the truth clearly. Maybe the worst part of all of this was that I still didn't even know the man's name. But I was going to find out. I didn't sleep at all that night. I didn't even try to close my eyes. I just lay there staring at the ceiling while the sound of her footsteps echoed from downstairs. She was pacing slowly and unhurriedly, like this wasn't the complete collapse of everything we'd built together. At one point, I heard the back door open and then close again. No words, no explanation from her about where she was going. Just the sound of her leaving the house like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched the digital clock on my nightstand as the minutes crawled by. It was 12:17 a.m. when I heard the door the first time. I kept watching as the display changed to 1:43, then 3:05, then 4:11. At 4:11 a.m., she finally returned. I could hear her quiet steps moving through the house, and she didn't turn on any lights as she moved around downstairs. But I knew it was her coming back. I could feel the presence of her dishonesty drifting up the stairs like cigarette smoke. She didn't come to the bedroom that night. She didn't even crack the door open to check on me. I waited for her, not out of hope or because I thought she might say something real or meaningful, but because I needed to see how she would act when she thought I was asleep. But I never got that chance, because by morning she was gone again. Her side of the bed was completely untouched, like she hadn't even existed in this house for weeks. There was no note left behind, no explanation, nothing at all to acknowledge what had happened between us. On the kitchen counter, right next to her half-drunk wine glass from the night before, sat a phone. It was her old phone, one that she must have forgotten about after switching to her new device. Curiosity isn't a crime when you've been betrayed, so I opened it up. There was no password protection on it. She must have forgotten to reset the security settings after getting her new phone. Or maybe she'd left it there on purpose. Maybe it was some kind of power move, or maybe it was her way of sending me a warning. Either way, it was like a loaded gun sitting there on the counter, and I decided to pull the trigger. I went straight to her text messages and scrolled past the group chats with her friends, past conversations with coworkers, past family group threads that looked perfectly normal. Then I found a conversation thread with no contact name, just a phone number at the top. The most recent message had been sent 2 nights ago, and it read, "Same time tomorrow, I miss you already." I scrolled up through the conversation, and what I found made my stomach drop. There were dozens of messages, photos, audio notes, inside jokes, and sweet nothings. The kind of intimate communication she used to share with me years ago, before things got comfortable and routine, before our affection had faded into background noise. Then I found the name buried about halfway through the conversation. It was in a message where she was complaining to him about how annoyed she was that he, meaning me, was coming home early that night. The name was Ryan. No last name, no contact photo, but that was enough information for now. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the same table that was still sticky from when she'd spilled wine the week before and never bothered to clean it properly. But that didn't matter anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed Brandon's number. He answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting for my call. "Talk to me," he said immediately, his voice alert despite the early hour. "His name is Ryan," I said without any preamble. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Then Brandon exhaled slowly and deliberately. "Jesus, do you know him?" "I don't think so, but I can find out," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I want everything," I said firmly, feeling something cold and determined settling into place inside my chest. Who he is, what he does for a living, how she met him, everything possible. Brandon didn't ask why I needed this information. He didn't try to slow me down or talk sense into me. He just said, "Give me one day." I nodded even though he couldn't see it through the phone. As I hung up the phone, I looked around our living room with fresh eyes. There were the scented candles she'd always loved, filling the space with vanilla and lavender. On the wall hung that framed print of the city skyline I'd given her for our second anniversary last year. Sitting on the side table was the stupid ceramic bowl we'd made together at that pottery class she'd dragged me to. Something I'd complained about at first, but ended up actually enjoying despite myself. Everything in the room looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but it felt like I was sitting inside someone else's life now, like I was in a house that didn't want me there anymore. That's when I realized something important about my emotional state. I wasn't really angry yet, not in the way I knew I was going to be soon. Right now, I was still processing, still absorbing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. But I could feel the anger building somewhere deep inside me, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Brandon showed up the next evening around 6 p.m. He didn't call first to announce he was coming. He just knocked on the front door like it was any other ordinary night. When I opened it, he was standing there with a manila folder clutched in his hand, looking like we were characters in some kind of espionage movie. Neither of us smiled as we made eye contact. This wasn't a social visit, and we both knew it. We sat down at the dining table, the same table where Jessica had once lit candles and made homemade lasagna for one of our anniversaries, wearing one of my old flannel shirts and humming some Taylor Swift song off key. Now, the table just smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the emotional distance that had settled over our house like a toxic fog. Brandon dropped the folder onto the table's surface with a dull slap that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "Ryan Wilder," he said immediately, getting straight to business. 29 years old, works in commercial real estate. He used to bartend part-time at Blue Moon on 5th Street. That's apparently where they met. He paused and waited for me to react, but I didn't say anything yet. I was too focused on steeling myself for whatever was inside that folder. I opened it slowly, deliberately, like I was defusing a bomb. Inside were photos, screenshots, printouts of social media profiles, and even a couple of blurry surveillance-style shots that Brandon must have taken himself. One photo showed Jessica and Ryan sitting on the patio of that wine bar downtown, her hand resting casually on his arm, her head tilted back in mid-laugh. It was a laugh I recognized intimately because I used to be the reason for it. "She's not hiding it anymore," Brandon said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of what he'd discovered. "They've been out in public together, not far from here. They're either getting sloppy or they're just getting confident. Probably both." I nodded grimly and continued flipping through the pages slowly, deliberately, letting each piece of evidence sink in. Every photo felt like a small punch to the gut. Every screenshot of their private messages, "Wish you were here right now. You make me feel like myself again. He doesn't touch me anymore, doesn't see me," was another small cut that added to the growing wound. Then I saw something that broke the rhythm completely and made my blood run cold. It was a hotel receipt from 3 weeks ago, and when I looked at the date, my world tilted on its axis. "Wait," I said, stopping at that page and staring at it harder. "This date, this is our anniversary weekend." Brandon looked away uncomfortably, clearly dreading this part of the conversation. "Yeah, I know," he said quietly. I stared at the receipt with growing disbelief. Room number, timestamp, everything was documented in black and white. She had told me she had to work late that Friday, said she was staying at the office to finish a big project with a tight deadline. I had brought home Chinese takeout that night and eaten alone, thinking she was just overwhelmed with work stress. I'd even left a sweet note on her pillow. Some cheesy "I love you" message just to remind her that I was thinking of her and supporting her even when she was busy. While I was writing "I love you" to an empty house, she was in a hotel bed with another man. The room started to spin a little, and I felt genuinely dizzy for a moment. "Does he know she's married?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Brandon shrugged uncertainly. "Hard to say for sure, but probably. Some of the messages sound like he thinks it's not serious or that it's ending soon, but he has to know something." I dropped the folder completely and leaned back in my chair, letting out a single, sharp laugh that was completely devoid of any humor. "She really had the balls to use our anniversary," I said, shaking my head in amazement. "She didn't even wait for it to pass first." Brandon didn't speak. He didn't have to say anything. The silence was loud enough to fill the entire room with the weight of what we'd discovered. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where life was continuing normally. A kid rode past on his bike with earbuds in, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding inside our house. The normal world kept moving along, indifferent to how mine was cracking apart piece by piece. Then I heard the sound of our garage door opening, and my heart seized up for a split second. She was home. Brandon stood up quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the timing. "I should go," he said, already moving toward the door. "No," I stopped him firmly, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. "Stay here." He blinked, clearly surprised by my response. "You sure about that?" "I want her to see you here," I said, and I meant it. I was done hiding, done pretending, done protecting her from the consequences of her actions. The front door opened, and there she was. Jessica walked in with her sunglasses pushed up into her hair and a reusable grocery bag slung over her shoulder, looking for all the world like she'd just returned from some wholesome errand. The moment she saw both of us sitting there, her casual smile vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Oh, look at this! How cute!" she said, her voice dripping with pure sarcasm. "The Betrayal Boys Club is having a meeting." I stepped forward toward her, feeling a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in months. "Sit down," I said firmly. She raised an eyebrow and looked at me like I'd just said something amusing. "Or what?" she challenged, clearly testing to see if I had any real authority left in this house. "Sit down," I repeated, my voice steady and unwavering. She stared at me for a moment, then smirked in that infuriating way she'd perfected. Finally, she walked slowly to the chair across from me and sat down like she was attending a job interview she didn't want to be at. The casual arrogance in her movements was staggering. "You're making this very dramatic," she said dismissively, tossing her keys carelessly onto the table where they landed with a sharp clatter. "I assume you've seen my text by now." "No," I said flatly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I've read them." She leaned back in her chair, completely unfazed by my correction. If anything, she seemed amused by the distinction. "And what, you're disgusted with me now?" she asked, and then she actually laughed, a sound that was equal parts bitter and mocking. "Oh, please, Tyler, you're not a saint. Don't act like you haven't checked out of this relationship years ago." "You could have ended it like an adult," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me. She stared at me with those cold eyes I was starting to recognize as her true face, then said very calmly, "You don't walk away from a dead animal, Tyler. You bury it." The words hit me harder than a physical slap across the face. The casual cruelty of her statement, the way she delivered it like she was discussing the weather, left me momentarily speechless. Brandon, who had been quietly observing this entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Jessica, do you even care what you've done to him?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern and disbelief. She turned to him slowly, tilting her head like she was studying an interesting specimen. "Don't pretend like you give a damn about us, Brandon," she said with icy precision. "You've been waiting for this breakdown for years." Brandon flinched like she'd struck him, and I looked between them, confused by the implication in her words. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, feeling like I was missing some crucial piece of information. Jessica stood up slowly, brushing off invisible lint from her clothes with deliberate theatrical movements. "It means your friend isn't as innocent as he looks," she said, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet tone. "Ask him how many times he's texted me things he shouldn't have texted. Ask him how many late-night heart-to-heart conversations we had before he ever told you anything about Ryan." I turned to Brandon with wide eyes, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet yet again. "She's twisting it," he said quickly, his voice defensive and panicked. I swear to God, Tyler, I never... Save it, I said suddenly, feeling an overwhelming exhaustion wash over me. Both of you just save it. Jessica was already walking toward the stairs, clearly done with this conversation. Let me know when I need to call a lawyer, she said over her shoulder with casual indifference. Or if you want to cry some more. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing up the stairs until I heard the bedroom door slam shut. It wasn't a loud, childish slam. It was controlled and intentional, designed to let me know that she was done speaking for the night, but not done with me yet. Not until she'd had the final word. Brandon sat down slowly, heavily, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. I didn't sit down. I stayed standing, staring at the spot where she'd been just moments before. I believe you, I told him, though my voice sounded flat and emotionally drained. But I also don't care right now. We sat in silence again. But this time, everything felt different. Because now it wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This had become a complete war between us. The bedroom door slammed upstairs one more time. That same controlled, intentional sound that seemed designed to remind me that she wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't move from my spot for a long while. I just sat across from Brandon in the same chair, in the same room, in the same damn house that had somehow become something between a crime scene and a museum of completely wasted time. The silence this time wasn't loud or oppressive. It was just dead and empty, like all the life had been sucked out of our home. Brandon cleared his throat nervously, breaking the quiet. She's lying, man. About the messages. About me, he said, his voice heavy with guilt that seemed to run deeper than just this situation. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I could see that he wore guilt like it was stitched into his skin. But it wasn't the guilt of betrayal exactly. It was something else entirely. The guilt of someone who had watched a car crash happen in slow motion and hadn't shouted loud enough to stop it. She talked to you about us? I asked, needing to understand the full scope of what had been happening behind my back. Before all this Ryan stuff started? He nodded slowly, like he was confessing to a crime. Months ago, she'd text me late sometimes. She'd say she felt invisible in the marriage, that you two weren't connecting anymore. I told her to talk to you directly about it. I told her she was being unfair to you. And you never told me any of this, I said, though it came out more as a statement than an accusation. I didn't think it was going anywhere serious, he said defensively. I thought she was just venting, maybe trying to stir something up between you two. I didn't want to make things worse by getting in the middle of it. I took a deep breath, but it didn't help ease the tightness in my chest. Guess she stirred up more than that, I said bitterly. Brandon stood up, his fists clenched at his sides like he was preparing for a fight that would never come. I didn't help her cheat, Tyler, he said, his voice desperate for me to understand. I didn't know it had gotten this far. If I had known... I believe you, I said, my voice completely flat and emotionless. But that doesn't mean I trust you anymore. He winced like I'd physically slapped him, the words hitting harder than any anger I could have directed at him. Then he left quietly, moving like someone leaving a funeral service where they'd said the wrong thing to the grieving family. Once the door clicked shut behind him, I let my head fall into my hands and sat there in the oppressive silence. I don't know how long I remained in that position. Minutes, hours. What do clocks matter when time has stopped making any sense? The concept of linear progression felt meaningless in a house where everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. At some point, I stood up and climbed the stairs like they were made of lead, each step requiring tremendous effort. The bedroom door was closed tight, sealed off like a fortress. I didn't knock, didn't ask for permission. I just opened it and walked in. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in her lap, one knee bouncing nervously. It was the first sign of actual anxiety I'd seen from her all night. She didn't look up when I entered the room, keeping her eyes fixed on the phone screen like it contained the answers to all of life's problems. I'm moving into the guest room, I announced, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Still, she didn't look at me. I waited for some kind of response, but got nothing but continued silence. Then she whispered very quietly, so softly I almost missed it. You don't have to do that. I stared at her in disbelief. Oh, we're cuddling now, I asked, sarcasm dripping from every word. She rolled her eyes at the ceiling like I was being unreasonable. You're being dramatic about this, she said with the same tone she might use to criticize my choice of breakfast cereal. Dramatic? I stepped closer into the room, feeling my composure finally starting to crack. You cheated on me, Jessica. You lied to me repeatedly for months. You didn't just betray me, you spit on everything we built together. She stood up now, too, moving a little slower than usual, like she was thinking carefully and measuring her words before she spoke them. "I'm not the villain you want me to be," she said, and there was something almost pleading in her voice. I let out a laugh that had absolutely nothing to do with amusement. It was a sound born from complete disbelief at the audacity of what she was saying. "You sure about that? You think this is just about Ryan?" she said, her voice getting stronger and more defensive. "It's not about him at all. You've been absent for years, Tyler. You buried yourself in work projects and left me to rot in this house alone. Don't pretend you didn't see this coming." I took 2 steps closer to her, close enough that we were only a breath apart. The proximity felt dangerous, charged with all the anger and hurt that had been building between us. I saw that something was wrong. "Yeah," I said, my voice low and controlled. "But I never thought you were fucking someone else behind my back." She blinked, and for just a moment, I saw her eyes flicker with something that might have been genuine emotion. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. "Good night," I said firmly, and left the room before she could respond. The guest room smelled like old laundry detergent and disuse, the scent of abandonment that comes from spaces that are rarely occupied. I lay down on the stiff mattress and stared at the ceiling again, the same ceiling I'd been staring at, but now with a completely different weight pressing down on me. This wasn't the crushing weight of shock and betrayal anymore. This was something colder and more calculating. Pure, crystalline resolve. I didn't cry, didn't punch the wall, didn't do anything dramatic or cathartic. I just lay there and let something harder than grief settle over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't going to be one of those quiet, polite divorces where we split custody of the blender and forced smiles at mutual friends' weddings. There was no way in hell I was going to make this easy for her. If she wanted out of our marriage, she was going to feel every single bit of it. If she wanted to wage war with me, I was prepared to bring the fire and burn everything down if necessary. The woman who had casually destroyed our relationship while sipping wine and acting like I was the problem had just made the biggest miscalculation of her life. The next morning was way too quiet. There was no music playing from her phone speaker while she went through her usual hair routine. No running water from the shower, no footsteps echoing down the hallway. Just the thick silence of avoidance settling into the house like a permanent fog that would never lift. I lay in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling again, experiencing the same thoughts as the night before. Only now they were sharper, cleaner, and more focused. The numbness was completely gone, replaced with crystal clear clarity about what needed to happen next. I was done playing the role of the stunned, devastated husband. I wasn't going to wait around anymore to see if she would come clean or apologize or try to salvage anything from the wreckage of our marriage. She had already chosen her side with devastating clarity. I just hadn't chosen mine yet. Until right now. I got up and pulled on a hoodie, then left the guest room with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. She was in the kitchen again, pouring herself a cup of coffee like she hadn't detonated our entire marriage 2 days ago, like absolutely nothing had happened. She was wearing one of my flannel shirts, unbuttoned, careless, and looking smugger than ever. She didn't say a word when she saw me enter the kitchen. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice neutral and controlled. She raised an eyebrow like she wasn't sure where I was going with this attempt at civilized conversation. I poured myself a cup of coffee too, deliberately avoiding any small talk or breakfast banter. This was war preparation mode, and she was about to find out exactly what that meant. "I want you out by the end of the week," I said, my voice calm but final. That definitely got her attention. She set her coffee cup down a little too hard, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "Excuse me?" she said, clearly not expecting this level of directness from me. "You heard me clearly," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "You don't want to be here anymore. You made that crystal clear with your actions, so don't be here." "This is my house too," she said, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. "Not for much longer," I said with absolute certainty. She stared at me with a mixture of surprise and anger, like she couldn't believe I had the audacity to take control of the situation. "You're not kicking me out of my life, Tyler," she said, her voice getting sharper. "Don't forget that this mess didn't start with Ryan. Yeah, it started the night you decided your loneliness gave you the right to start a second life behind my back," I shot back, feeling my own anger finally beginning to surface. She looked like she wanted to hit me with something heavy from the kitchen counter, her face contorting with barely contained rage. Instead, she forced herself to smile coldly, the expression calculated and deliberate like everything else she did these days. "Funny how you're suddenly full of spine when it's way too late to matter," she said, each word designed to cut as deeply as possible. That one stung, and she knew it. The accusation hung in the air between us like poison gas, filling the space with the implication that I was somehow at fault for not fighting harder for a relationship she'd been secretly destroying for months. "I'll pack my things," she said finally, her voice taking on a tone of grudging defeat. "But I'm not rushing around just because you grew a pair overnight." "You've got 5 days," I told her firmly, establishing a concrete deadline that left no room for negotiation or manipulation. She didn't respond to the ultimatum. Instead, she grabbed her coffee mug and walked out of the kitchen like she was dismissing me from my own home. The casual arrogance of her exit was infuriating, but I didn't let it show. I had bigger plans now. The second she was gone from the kitchen, I pulled out my phone and texted Brandon immediately. "I need a lawyer, a good one." He replied within minutes, like he'd been waiting by his phone for exactly this message. "I got you covered, sending name now. Call her today, she's a complete shark." "Good," I texted back without hesitation. "That's exactly what I need right now." I spent the rest of the morning taking photos of every shared document in the filing cabinet by our desk. Bank statements, insurance papers, property titles, anything that might become ammunition later in what I now knew would be a legal battle. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the chaotic, emotional way I had been before. Now it was tactical and strategic. Now it was about control and winning. This had never really been about Ryan, not at the core of it. This was about Jessica losing respect for me years ago and deciding that I didn't need to know about it. This was about the slow fade that she blamed on me, but that she had orchestrated step by step until she could pretend it had just happened naturally, like some kind of inevitable relationship entropy. I wasn't going to let her rewrite that story. Not to her friends, not to my family, not to Ryan, and not to anyone else who would listen to her version of events. She wanted to rewrite the narrative completely, to make herself the victim of a neglectful husband who had driven her into the arms of someone who appreciated her. Fine. I'd hand her the pen to write that story, but only after I burned every blank page first. I called the lawyer that same afternoon. Her name was Victoria Chen, and from the first 30 seconds of our phone conversation, I knew that Brandon hadn't been exaggerating about her being a shark. Her voice was sharp and clipped, efficient in a way that told me she didn't waste time with pleasantries or emotional hand-holding. She didn't offer condolences about my failing marriage or ask how I was feeling about the situation. Instead, she offered strategy, which was exactly what I needed. "You need to document everything," she said without preamble. "Receipts, text messages, call logs, any photos or notes you have about her absences or suspicious behavior. Start building your timeline now. If you think she'll come after the house, savings, retirement accounts, you need to prepare immediately, especially if she's the one who stepped out of the marriage." There was a brief pause before she asked the crucial question. "Do you have proof?" "I've got screenshots from her old phone," I said, feeling a grim satisfaction at having that evidence locked away safely. I could almost hear her nodding approvingly through the phone. "Good. That'll matter in court," she said with professional satisfaction. "We'll get ahead of this situation and make sure you're protected." I didn't tell her how much those screenshots had hurt to read, how seeing the evidence of Jessica's betrayal laid out in black and white had felt like having my chest cavity ripped open. That wasn't Victoria's job to care about. Her job was to help me win. And suddenly that was the only thing I wanted. I spent the next few hours gathering everything I could think of that might be relevant. My hands didn't shake anymore, and my breathing was steady and controlled. I was in the zone completely, operating with the same focused efficiency I brought to managing complex construction sites when everyone else was flailing around in confusion. I was the only one who could see the blueprint clearly, and I was going to execute it perfectly. By the time Jessica came home that evening, I had filled 3 manila folders with evidence, scanned everything into a secure cloud drive, and created a comprehensive list of accounts, usernames, and passwords. I knew which items in the house were definitively mine, which ones she would try to argue about, and which ones I was willing to let burn just to watch her reaction when she realized I was serious about this. She came through the front door carrying shopping bags from Nordstrom like it was just any other ordinary day. I stared at her with undisguised amazement, and she noticed my expression immediately. "What?" she asked, irritation creeping into her voice. "Don't start with me today." "I'm amazed," I said simply, letting the words hang in the air between us. She dropped her shopping bags by the door and tossed her keys into the ceramic bowl with more force than necessary. "At what exactly?" she demanded. "At how completely unbothered you are," I said. studying her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. At how quickly you flip the switch from cheating wife to insulted tenant who thinks she's being treated unfairly. She gave me a look like I was the one with the problem, like I was the one who had done something wrong. Don't pretend like you've been Mr. Innocent in this marriage, she shot back defensively. I never stepped out on you, I said, my voice getting harder with each word. I never lied to your face repeatedly for months on end. I never gave myself to someone else and then came home to eat dinner like nothing had happened. Oh, please, she snapped back with venom in her voice. You think cheating is just about bodies? You checked out on me 2 years ago, Tyler. I was invisible in this house. You didn't notice when I changed my hair. You didn't ask how I was feeling about anything. You never touched me unless I asked first. You think that doesn't count as betrayal? I think it means you could have talked to me, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Instead of screwing around behind my back with some bartender. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was measuring her words for maximum impact. You want the truth, Tyler? You want all of it? I didn't move, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I just stayed perfectly still and waited for whatever bomb she was about to drop. I stayed because I thought you'd wake up eventually, she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. I thought maybe you'd notice me again, look at me the way you used to years ago when we first got together. But the longer I waited, the more I realized you were never going to change. So yeah, I found someone who did notice me, someone who made me feel like I mattered. And you decided I didn't deserve to know, I said, my voice deadly quiet. You decided I wasn't worth the honesty of a conversation about how unhappy you were. She smirked at me with that infuriating expression I was learning to hate. You would have made it ugly, she said, with complete confidence. You would have thrown guilt at me and made yourself the victim, just like you're doing right now. I let that accusation hang in the air for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of what she was saying. Then I did something that clearly caught her off guard. You're right, I said finally, my voice calm and measured. I would have done exactly that. She blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting me to agree with her assessment. And you know what else? I continued, stepping past her to grab her shopping bags from where she'd dropped them by the door. I picked them up and set them gently on the front porch, my movements deliberate and controlled. Victims can still fight back. You're such a child, she muttered, walking upstairs like she was dismissing me from a conversation that had become beneath her attention. I closed the front door slowly and turned the lock. Not to keep her out, but to feel for 1 second like something in this house still belonged to me, like I still had some measure of control over my own space. The next day, I called out of work for the first time in months. I told my foreman I had a family emergency and he said, "Take all the time you need, man." I appreciated the kindness, but it barely registered in my consciousness. Everything outside this house had become background noise, irrelevant static. My entire world had narrowed down to these walls, this woman, and the elaborate lie she had planted like rot beneath the floorboards of our life together. I spent the morning methodically labeling boxes, not for her things, but for mine. She was still dragging her feet, still daring me to make the first official move towards separation. So I decided to do exactly that. I packed my books, my tools, my personal keepsakes, anything that was unquestionably mine. I didn't say a word about what I was doing, didn't ask for her permission or input. I just made the situation real and concrete in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Jessica came downstairs around noon with her phone permanently attached to her hand, as always. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing an oversized sweatshirt with no makeup. The kind of casual, effortless look that used to make me think she was beautiful. Now it just looked like camouflage for someone who didn't want to put effort into anything, including her own appearance. When she saw the boxes lined up in the hallway, she let out a half laugh that was equal parts amused and mocking. "Wow," she said, shaking her head like I was putting on some kind of performance. "You're really going for the whole wounded cowboy routine, huh?" I didn't respond to her comment. I just kept packing, maintaining my focus on the task at hand. She walked into the kitchen, rummaged around for something, then circled back to the hallway where I was working. "You know this isn't going to play out the way you think it will," she said, her voice taking on that superior tone she used when she thought she knew something I didn't. I glanced up from my packing. "And how do I think it's going to play out?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear her assessment of the situation. "You think everyone's going to side with you," she said with complete confidence. You think they'll see me as the evil witch and you as the betrayed perfect husband. But people aren't that simple, Tyler. Relationships are complicated, and most adults understand that. No, I said firmly, looking her directly in the eyes. Loyalty is that simple. She rolled her eyes dramatically at my response. Right, so Brandon's your new moral compass now? She asked with that same mocking tone. Brandon didn't lie to my face for months, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. Didn't he though? She said. And there was something loaded in that question, something that made my stomach drop. I stopped packing completely and gave her my full attention. What's that supposed to mean? She smiled again. That same loaded gun smile that I was learning to recognize as a warning sign. Ask him what really happened at Kate's birthday party, she said casually, like she was discussing the weather. The night you got too drunk to drive home, and he offered to take me back to the house. I stared at her in complete silence, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet once again. You're bluffing, I said, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into my own voice. Am I? She challenged, raising an eyebrow like she was daring me to find out. Instead of answering, she picked up her phone and walked back upstairs, leaving me standing there with that conversational grenade she'd just dropped. I could practically hear her waiting for it to explode, could sense her satisfaction at having planted another seed of doubt in my mind. Damn it, but it worked perfectly. I sat there for a full hour with that single sentence looping in my head like a song stuck on repeat. I tried to brush it off completely, to tell myself that she was just deflecting and manipulating the situation, to take attention away from her own actions. But doubt doesn't need solid evidence to sink its claws in deep. It just needs the whisper of possibility, the suggestion that maybe things aren't exactly what they seem. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I picked up my phone and texted Brandon. Were you ever alone with Jessica the night of Kate's birthday party? A minute passed, then another. The silence felt longer than it should have for such a straightforward question. Finally, he replied, Yeah, why? My heart sank as I stared at the screen. Did anything happen between you two? I typed, dreading the answer but needing to know. This time, the wait was much longer than it should have been for someone with a clear conscience. When his response finally came through, it felt like a punch to the gut. We kissed once. She said it was a mistake. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to make things worse. I dropped my phone, not from shock exactly, but from the realization that was hitting me like a freight train. I was completely alone in this situation. My wife was a liar, my best friend was a coward who had been keeping secrets, and I was done trusting either of them with anything that mattered to me. That night, I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked tight. Not because I was afraid of Jessica, but because I didn't want her thinking she could still come in whenever she felt like it. Like she still had unlimited access to every part of my life. By the end of the week, the emotional thermostat in our house had dropped to absolute freezing. Jessica and I passed each other like strangers in a hotel lobby, barely speaking, never looking each other in the eye, moving through our shared space with the careful choreography of people who were actively avoiding any meaningful contact. Her things were still everywhere, though. Her shoes clustered by the front door, her lotion bottles crowding the bathroom sink, that hideous knit blanket her mother had given her still draped over the couch like it had seniority over everything else in the room. She hadn't packed a single box yet, despite my ultimatum, and I hadn't asked her about it again either. That morning, I decided to go see Victoria Chen in person for the first time. Her office was exactly what I'd expected. All clean lines and dark furniture, professional but intimidating. Victoria herself wore all black and had the kind of presence that reminded me of a loaded crossbow, calm and controlled. But you instinctively knew not to test it. Based on what you've given me, she said, flipping through her notes with practiced efficiency, we're in a very good position here. She hasn't denied the affair. You've got solid documentation with dates and details, and you even have witness accounts from Brandon about her public behavior with this Ryan person. If she tries to go after the house or push for spousal support, we can push back hard. Good, I said firmly, feeling a surge of satisfaction at hearing those words. I want this clean and fast, no unnecessary drama. She paused and looked up at me with the kind of direct eye contact that lawyers use when they're about to deliver uncomfortable truths. There's going to be drama, Tyler. Don't kid yourself about that, she said matter-of-factly. But I'll make sure it lands on her instead of you. That was all I needed to hear. The confirmation that I had a professional on my side who understood exactly what this was and how to handle it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. On the way home, I stopped by my parents' house. My mother tried to ask how I was doing, using that gentle, probing tone that mothers perfect over decades of practice. For once, I decided to tell her the truth instead of deflecting with generic reassurances. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired of people lying to me," I said, and the honesty felt surprisingly liberating. She nodded with that silent understanding that only mothers seem to be able to pull off. She didn't press for details or ask specific questions about Jessica. She just handed me a tin of homemade cookies like it was armor for the battle I was clearly preparing to fight. I got home around 6 p.m. to find that the lights were on throughout the house and music was playing softly from the kitchen. The domestic sounds were so unexpected that I actually paused in the hallway, listening. Jessica was cooking something. Actually cooking, which was something she hadn't done for me in over a year. I stood there for a moment, watching her through the doorway. Her hair was down, she was wearing an apron, and she was cutting vegetables with focused concentration like we were living in a completely different life, in a different house entirely. I walked into the kitchen slowly, unsure of what I was witnessing. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing at the elaborate meal preparation happening around me. She didn't look up from her cutting board. "Dinner," she said simply. "For who exactly?" I pressed, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. Finally, she met my eyes. "For us." I couldn't help it. I laughed. The sound came out sharp and completely humorless. "You're serious right now?" She wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned to face me fully. "I know things got out of control," she said, and there was something in her voice that almost sounded like vulnerability. "But maybe we can just talk. Just talk like adults about what's been happening." I took a step closer to her, not because I was interested in whatever performance this was, but because I needed to see her face up close, to study the expression she was wearing while she tried to manipulate me. "Talk about what, Jessica?" I asked, my voice dripping with skepticism. "The affair with Ryan? The fact that my best friend kissed you too? The way you've been lying to my face with complete conviction for months?" She winced just slightly at the directness of my questions, but it wasn't enough to break through whatever act she was putting on. "You're not innocent either, Tyler," she said, falling back on her favorite deflection. "You keep saying that, but you never have a damn example of what I supposedly did wrong." She looked away from me then, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, her voice took on something that sounded almost genuine. I don't want to end it like this," she said quietly. "We were good once upon a time. That has to count for something." "That version of us is dead," I said without hesitation. "You killed it with secret text messages and hotel receipts on our anniversary." The oven beeped in the background, but neither of us moved toward it. The sound just hung in the air like a reminder that this whole domestic scene was as artificial as everything else she'd been doing lately. "I'm filing the papers on Monday," I announced, watching her face for any genuine reaction. "Victoria's already drawing everything up." She nodded slowly, and I thought I saw her eyes glisten with the beginning of tears. But I didn't trust tears from her anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not ever again. "Then, let me cook you one last meal," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No strings attached, no expectations. Just something nice before it all ends." Against my better judgment, against every instinct that was screaming at me to walk away from this obvious manipulation, I found myself sitting down at the dining table. Maybe I wanted to see if she still remembered how to be real with me. Maybe I just wanted to watch her pretend one last time, to see how far she was willing to take this performance before dropping the mask completely. The dinner turned out to be absolutely perfect. Too perfect, actually. Pan-seared chicken with a golden crust, roasted asparagus with just the right amount of seasoning, and a bottle of wine we'd been saving from our honeymoon that had never been opened until tonight. She'd uncorked it like this was some kind of farewell toast instead of the final scene of a crime. She set the table like it actually mattered, with properly folded napkins and lit candles, the kind of effort she hadn't made for our relationship in years. I didn't touch the wine at all, and she noticed immediately. "You're really not going to even try?" she asked softly, gesturing toward my untouched glass. "I came to listen, not to forgive," I said, making my position crystal clear. She nodded at my response and took a bite of her food, looking calm and composed, like she was hosting a dinner party instead of facing the death of our marriage. "I meant what I said earlier," she said, keeping her eyes focused on her plate. "We were good once." "I remember," I said simply. "I just didn't realize I was the only one still trying to be good." "You really believe that?" she asked, finally looking up at me. "You think I woke up one day and decided to cheat for no reason at all?" "No, I think you made a series of choices," I replied, my voice getting harder with each word. Every single one of them selfish. Right? She said with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because you're the saint here. The victim, the perfect husband who never did anything wrong. I'm not perfect, I admitted, but I was faithful to you. And that used to mean something important. She set her fork down deliberately, the small sound echoing in the quiet dining room. Do you want to know how it started? She asked directly, her voice taking on a different quality. No, I said immediately. Tough, she said, her voice shifting and hardening like steel. You're going to hear it anyway. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table with her wine glass sitting untouched between us. I ran into him by accident, she began, and I could tell she'd been waiting to tell this story for a long time. Ryan, at a work networking event. He was charming, funny, attentive in a way that felt almost foreign to me. He looked at me, really looked at me, not past me or through me like I was just another piece of furniture in the room. I clenched my jaw but didn't interrupt her. He asked questions about me, she continued, her voice getting stronger as she warmed to her narrative. Real questions, not just what's for dinner or did you remember to pay the electric bill? He wanted to know what I was thinking about, what I was working on, how I felt about things that mattered to me. And that gave you permission to betray our marriage? I asked, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. That gave me perspective, she snapped back with sudden venom. I'd been lonely for years, Tyler. Not weeks, not months, years. You think being physically present in this house meant anything when you never actually saw me? When you looked right through me like I was invisible? I found myself clenching my fists under the table. You know what's funny? She continued, clearly building momentum. I kept waiting for you to notice something was wrong, to care enough to ask if I was okay, if we were okay. You never did, so I eventually stopped waiting. You could have just left me, I said, my voice barely controlled. I should have, she admitted without hesitation, and the casual way she said it hit harder than any of her accusations. The silence that followed was thick and unforgiving, cutting through the air between us like a blade. I stood up from the table, having heard more than enough. This was a mistake, I said, pushing my chair back. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sitting down for dinner or marrying me in the first place? She asked. Letting you cook me dinner like this made anything okay, I replied, turning toward the door to leave this conversation behind. But then she said something that stopped me completely in my tracks, something I wasn't prepared for at all. I'm pregnant. I froze completely in place, every muscle in my body locking up. No, you're not, I said automatically, like denial could make it untrue. I am, she said with quiet certainty. You're lying to me again, I accused, though something in her voice made me doubt my own words. I took 2 tests, both positive, she said matter-of-factly. I found out 3 days ago. The silence that followed wasn't sharp or angry like our previous silences had been. This time it was completely empty, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I turned around very slowly, feeling like I was moving through thick water. Whose is it? I asked, though my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else entirely. She didn't answer me. She just sat there, looking at me with that same composed expression she'd worn throughout this entire nightmare. I stepped closer to her, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Jessica, whose baby is it? She looked me dead in the eyes and said absolutely nothing. That silence, that refusal to answer, told me everything I needed to know. I don't remember sitting back down. 1 minute I was standing there frozen with shock, my heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear the rain that had started falling outside again. The next minute, I was back in my chair, my hands clenched in fists on the table, staring at the flickering candle flame like it was going to give me some kind of clarity or guidance. She was still sitting across from me, still calm, still Jessica. Only now, she was Jessica +1. Say something, she finally whispered, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over our ruined dinner. I did, I muttered, barely able to form words. I asked who the father is. I don't know, she admitted, and the casual way she delivered this earth-shattering information made me feel like I was losing my mind. That's when I really looked at her, actually looked at her and saw what was written across her face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It wasn't regret or guilt or any of the emotions you'd expect from someone who had just revealed they were carrying a child and couldn't identify the father. It was just resignation, acceptance. Like this was simply another problem to be managed, rather than a catastrophic complication that would affect the rest of our lives. You slept with both of us, I said slowly, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. At the same time. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain or justify what she'd done. She just sat there with that same resigned expression, like she was waiting for me to finish processing the information so we could move on to whatever came next. I stood up again, this time pushing my chair back so hard it nearly fell over. "You don't even care, do you?" I said, my voice cracking for the first time in days. "You didn't just ruin our marriage, Jessica. You detonated it completely. You brought a baby into this disaster, and you can't even tell me who the father is." Her eyes finally welled up with tears, but still no apology. Still no expression of regret for the choices that had led us to this moment. "You think this was easy for me?" She shot back defensively. "You think I wanted this to happen? I was confused, angry, lost. You weren't there for me emotionally, and he made me feel like I mattered again." "You didn't just cheat, Jessica," I said, my voice low and controlled despite the rage building inside me. "You replaced me completely. You put someone else in my place in every way that matters. And now you're looking at me like I'm supposed to feel sorry for you." "I didn't replace you," she said, her voice getting defensive. "You gave up your place in this relationship long before I met Ryan." "No," I said firmly, meeting her eyes with absolute conviction. "I just didn't know I had to fight for my place in my own damn house." She stood up now too, tears finally spilling down her cheeks in a way that might have moved me just weeks earlier. But now those tears looked like just another manipulation tactic, another tool in her arsenal of emotional warfare. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But it did happen, and I'm trying, Tyler. I'm really trying here." "Trying what exactly?" I demanded, my patience completely exhausted. "To rewrite the ending," she said desperately. "To find some way to make this work, to salvage something from what we had." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "There is no ending to rewrite, Jessica," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Not anymore. You killed any possibility of that when you decided to destroy everything we built together. And now there's a child caught in the middle of this wreckage." She wrapped her arms around herself like the room had suddenly gotten cold, like she was trying to hold herself together physically. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I heard genuine fear creeping into her voice. I stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I knew exactly what my answer was going to be. The clarity was almost overwhelming. "I'm going to be done with you," I said with absolute finality, "completely and permanently done." She flinched at my words like I'd struck her physically. "And if that child is mine," I continued, my voice steady and controlled, "I'll be there for it in every way that matters. But if it's his," I shook my head slowly, "that's not my burden to carry. That's yours to figure out." The candles on the table continued to burn lower, casting dancing shadows across our faces. The food had gone completely cold by now, untouched and forgotten like everything else that had once mattered in our relationship. I walked out of the dining room, out of the conversation, and out of the last shred of denial I'd been clinging to. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room, I could hear her crying for real this time. Deep, ugly sobs that might have broken my heart just days earlier. But I didn't stop walking, didn't turn around, didn't offer comfort or false hope. Because I was finally completely done mistaking her tears for genuine remorse or her pain for actual change. The following Monday, I filed the divorce papers. Victoria met me at the courthouse with her usual steely composure, but even she seemed to soften slightly when I handed her the finalized documentation. I think she understood that this wasn't just another client walking away from a bad marriage. This was a man walking away from a deliberate betrayal that had been layered with lies and dressed up in excuses and backhanded blame. I made sure Jessica wasn't home when the papers were served that afternoon. I'd planned it that way on purpose, timing my trip to the gym so that I wouldn't have to witness her initial reaction. I needed to feel the weight of everything, literally and metaphorically pressing against my chest. 200 pounds on the barbell, over and over again, just to prove to myself that I could still hold something heavy without it slipping away from me. When I returned home, she was sitting in the living room with the unopened envelope on the coffee table in front of her. Her expression was completely blank, like she'd shut down emotionally to protect herself from what she knew was inside. "You filed," she said simply. It wasn't a question. I nodded in response. "Told you I would." She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally diminished, like all the power she'd been clinging to throughout this entire sick game had finally slipped through her fingers. The smugness was gone completely, and the composure had cracked and broken. She wasn't the Jessica who had rolled her eyes at my pain anymore. She was just a woman standing in the ashes of a fire she had set herself. "You're really not going to try to fix this?" she asked, and there was something almost childlike in her voice. I smiled sadly, not bitterly, just with genuine sadness for what we'd lost and what could never be recovered. "I tried to fix us for 2 years, Jessica," I said quietly. "You were already gone. You just didn't have the guts to say it out loud." Her eyes filled with tears again, and this time they looked genuine. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered. And for the first time in months, she sounded vulnerable and lost, rather than calculating and defensive. "You'll figure it out," I told her with more kindness than she probably deserved. "You always do." She stood up slowly and crossed the room toward me, moving like someone who was testing whether the ground beneath her feet was still solid. "I meant what I said before," she said quietly. "I didn't want to hurt you like this." I looked at her directly, studying her face for any sign of the woman I'd once loved completely. "Then why did you?" I asked simply. The silence that followed filled the space between us with all the words neither of us would ever say. All the apologies that would never be enough, and all the explanations that wouldn't change anything. "You want to know the worst part?" I asked her directly, breaking the silence. "I wasn't even angry at first when I found out about Ryan. I was broken, completely shattered, devastated in a way I didn't know was possible. And now?" I stepped past her to grab my coat from the closet. "Now I don't even feel hate towards you anymore." She waited for me to finish the thought, her eyes fixed on my face. "I just feel free," I said simply. She nodded like that admission had hurt her more than anything else I could have said, more than anger or accusations or threats of revenge. I left the house before she could say anything else to me. I didn't slam the door behind me, didn't look back at the windows or the life I was walking away from. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was running away from something painful. Instead, I felt like I was walking toward something better, toward peace, toward freedom, toward the possibility of rebuilding my life on my own terms. Maybe I would sell this house and start over somewhere new. Maybe I would get a place where I could put up my own pictures and make my own memories. Maybe I would take a trip somewhere far away, somewhere quiet and peaceful, where I could think clearly about what I wanted my future to look like. I didn't know yet what shape that future would take, but what I did know with absolute certainty was this. Love doesn't die with a scream or a dramatic confrontation. It dies with silence, with avoidance, with selfishness dressed up as loneliness and justified with elaborate explanations. It dies when one person gives up while the other keeps holding the line, too stubborn or too loyal to notice they're the only one still fighting for something that's already gone. If you're reading this story, if you're in that place where something feels fundamentally off in your relationship, where the silence is getting heavier and the distance is growing wider, I want you to ask the hard questions now. Don't wait for a friend to call you with devastating news. Don't wait for hotel receipts to surface. Don't wait for anonymous text messages to reveal themselves on forgotten phones. Don't let love rot slowly because you were afraid of what you might discover when you started digging. I waited too long to confront the truth that was staring me in the face. I made excuses for behavior that should have been inexcusable. I told myself that the changes I was seeing were normal relationship evolution, that the distance and coldness were just temporary phases that would pass if I was patient enough. But patience becomes complicity when you use it to avoid asking the questions you know you need to ask. The signs were all there, laid out like a roadmap I chose not to follow because I was terrified of where it would lead me. The unexplained absences, the defensive reactions to simple questions, the way she guarded her phone like it contained state secrets, the gradual erosion of physical and emotional intimacy that I convinced myself was just the natural progression of a long-term relationship. I saw all of it, felt all of it, and chose to look the other way because confronting it seemed harder than living with the uncertainty. But here's what I learned. Uncertainty is its own kind of poison. It seeps into every interaction, every conversation, every moment of what should be companionship and trust. It turns you into a detective in your own home, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning. It makes you question your own instincts and gaslight yourself into believing that your concerns are paranoia rather than valid responses to real problems. I got out of that situation, but not before it nearly destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment. The betrayal wasn't just about Jessica sleeping with someone else. It was about the systematic dismantling of my reality, the way she made me feel crazy for noticing things that were actually happening, the way she turned my loyalty into a weapon against my own well-being. Now I get to rebuild my life one truth at a time. I get to choose what matters to me without having to factor in someone else's hidden agenda. I get to wake up in the morning without wondering what lie I'll discover that day. What new piece of evidence will surface to confirm suspicions I've been carrying around like lead weights in my chest? The house feels different now. Not empty, but clean. Like I've finally aired out rooms that had been closed off for too long, let light into spaces that had been dark and stagnant. I'm not angry anymore. Not the way I was during those first weeks when the betrayal felt like a physical wound that wouldn't heal. The anger burned out completely, leaving behind something much more valuable: clarity. I understand now that Jessica's affair wasn't really about me at all. It wasn't about my failings as a husband or my inability to meet her emotional needs. It was about her inability to communicate honestly about problems in our relationship. Her choice to seek solutions outside our marriage rather than working to fix what was broken between us. She chose deception over difficulty, chose the excitement of a secret relationship over the hard work of rebuilding what we had. And Brandon? I've forgiven him, but our friendship will never be what it was before. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal back to its original strength. It might mend, but there will always be a scar, a weak point that reminds you of what happened. He kept secrets he should have shared, made judgments about what I could and couldn't handle, decided that protecting me from painful information was more important than respecting my right to know what was happening in my own life. The pregnancy situation resolved itself in a way that was both heartbreaking and liberating. Jessica miscarried about 6 weeks after our final confrontation. I felt genuine sadness for the loss of potential life, but I also felt relief that I wouldn't have to spend years wondering whether I was raising my own child or living with a permanent reminder of her betrayal. Some people might judge me for feeling relief in that situation, but I've learned to stop caring about other people's opinions of my emotional responses to trauma. My name is Tyler, and I'm 29 years old. I'm finally learning what it means to choose myself first, to prioritize my own well-being over someone else's comfort with deception. I'm learning to trust my instincts again, to believe what I see rather than what someone tells me I should be seeing. I'm learning that love without honesty isn't love at all. It's just elaborate performance art designed to get your needs met, while avoiding the responsibility that comes with genuine intimacy. This isn't the ending I wanted for my marriage, but it's the beginning I needed for the rest of my life. It's not a happy ending in the traditional sense, but it's honest. And after months of living in a house built on lies, honesty feels like the most precious thing in the world. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're making excuses for behavior that your gut tells you is wrong, if you're walking on eggshells in your own home while your partner acts like you're the problem, trust yourself. Ask the hard questions. Demand answers that make sense. Don't let anyone convince you that your need for honesty is unreasonable or that your standards for basic respect are too high. You deserve a relationship built on truth, even when that truth is painful. You deserve a partner who chooses difficult conversations over easy deceptions, who fights for your relationship instead of fighting against your attempts to understand what's wrong. You deserve someone who sees your loyalty as a gift to be treasured, not a weakness to be exploited. And if you discover that you don't have those things, if you find out that the person you've been fighting for has been fighting against you all along, you deserve the courage to walk away and rebuild something better. It won't be easy, but it will be real. And real is worth more than all the beautiful lies you could ever construct to avoid facing the truth. The rain has stopped now, and for the first time in months, I can see clearly.